Coming this summer, Hollywood's biggest action movie, Rook versus Pawn. Okay, so maybe I overhyped this video a little bit. You might be wondering, Rook versus Pawn, we're really far into the Super King levels. This is going to be really easy. Of course, I'm tricking you. This is not going to be that easy. What happens when a Rook fights versus a Pawn? Well, we're going to look at many examples today. Now, in this first example, the black pawn is moving down the chessboard, and obviously White's Rook is in danger. And in this position, it's not what it looks like. I'm going to put it that way. We got a surprise Hollywood ending just to start things out. You may be thinking Rook to D1 gets the job done, keeping an eye on the pawn. Actually, Rook to D1 is only good enough for a draw because when Black plays the move D4, White can't make any progress with the Rook. And if the king tries to come around this way to get closer to the pawn, Black will actually get sort of a defensive opposition. And if King C7, Black will again get the opposition. Now, eventually, White might get frustrated and move the Rook, but that is exactly the tempo Black needs, because now when the Black king walks down the board, he's going to win a tempo on the Rook, and it's a draw. King C4, now White's king can advance. King C3, uh-oh, here comes the tempo loss. White has to save the Rook. D3, White's king gets a little bit closer, but then King C2 wins a tempo, and after D2, we can clearly see White is going to have to give up the Rook for the new queen, and it's going to be a draw. But if we go back to our starting position, White's Rook can actually stop on D3 or D2. Now, D3 is a little more surprising. Let's just pick D2. They are equally as good. Amazingly, Rook D2, not the same as Rook D1. That's right. We got our Hollywood ending, our surprise ending right away. Let's see why. Now, Black can still play D4. And now we waste our tempo with Rook to D1. That's the same tempo loss, but our Rook is further away than the Black king. Now, Black, if he moves his king here, you can actually get the opposition and then wait for him to pick a side, and then your king can go the other way. So there's no real difference with Black going sideways first or just charging down the board. Now your king can cross over, and after pawn to D3, your king can go to C5. It's important that your king travel this way so you don't give Black another opposition position. And after King C4, D2, King C3, we can see that White is collecting the pawn. Okay, they do get a little easier, chess kids, but not all of them. I kind of started you out with a tough one. This is our next position. This time, the black pawn is coming down the chessboard, just like before, okay? Now, in order to figure out if it's a win or a draw for White, we actually kind of need to know whose move it is. If it is Black's move, can you guess? It's actually not so easy. It is a draw. Black can play king to A2. In fact, he has to. And after king to B7, A3, king to C6, White has nothing better than to walk the king down the board. King to A1, king C5, A2. Now, you might have seen this in your analysis and thought, wait a minute. We don't have to stalemate Black. We can actually play the move king to B4 to unstalemate Black. But you know what? Black has one saving move. Black must play the move king to B2, and White can't make any progress, because if king to C4, check, you can play king to C2. And eventually the Rook has to move back to A8, and Black just moves the king back to B2, and you either check or you give away the Rook for the pawn. It's a draw. Now, if you're the defending side, you must be really careful. You might think king to A1 is still good enough for a draw. But if you play king to A1, surprisingly, White can now win by releasing the stalemate with king to B3, blocking the Rook's protection of B1. Okay, Black has to slide sideways. And now White plays Rook to H8 and allows Black to get a queen. Because after all, if Black gets a queen, it's a girl. But yeah, that's the saddest birth in history. Rook to H1 is made. Now again, you're thinking, but Fun Master Rank, call on me, please call on me. Okay, I know you can promote tonight. I get it. But it's a losing Rook versus Knight endgame. Unlike most Rook versus Knight endgames, which are a draw, Black's king and knight are starting out in such a bad position. White can win by king to C3. There are no good knight moves here. If you play knight to C2, I can just play Rook H1 check and collect your knight. And if you try king A2, I can play a little bit of a waiting move. And then when your king goes back, I can play Rook to E2, and you are totally in Zugzwang now. You either move your knight, you lose your knight, or you play king C1 and you get mated right away. So very careful defense gets the draw for Black. But we return to the same position. If it is White's move, I will tell you it is a win for White, but maybe you want to pause your videos and try to figure out how. Well, if you didn't pause your video and you just kept playing, you might have thought, okay, Fun Master Mike, I know the technique. I know, call on me. King to b7, blocking the attack on the b file. But actually, king to b7 does not win. That is only a drawing move. I saw this exact endgame come up between two chess masters once, and sure enough, the chess master playing white did play king b7, thinking that he was being very clever, but actually now it's a draw, because black king can now move off of the a file with king to b2, king c6 discovered check. Black can play the move king to c2, and amazingly, this is a draw. We're not going to go through every variation, but I'll just pick one. King to c5, black plays the move a3, king b4 threatening the pawn, but a2, and if you play rook to a8, black can play the move king to b2, and it's a draw, because white has to sacrifice the rook for the pawn. Let's go back to our starting position. The winning move for white, and it is only this move, is king to a7. That keeps the black king trapped on the side of the board. Let me show you why that is a big difference. Black only has one legal move, king to a2. Now we can keep charging down the board with king a6, a3, and we must move our king to a5. We do not want to let the black king off of the a file. King to a1, king to a4. So far, everything is forced, right? a2. Notice how nice it is when you don't give your opponent any options. And from here, I bet you can figure it out by using the knowledge you just learned in our previous example. That's right. You play king to b3, releasing the stalemate, and after king to b1, rook to h8, and we've already seen this position. Black can promote to queen or knight, but either way, it is a loss. Wow. Rook versus pawn. Such a tricky position. This one's quite famous, but in a sense, the opening moves are quite easy. If you let black's rook come to the square d6 and sacrifice for the pawn, obviously you can't win. So the first move has to be c7. And here, black obviously is having trouble sacrificing for the pawn. He's also having trouble getting to the c file, so black's best chance is to give check. If you move up, black's rook moves up and sacrifices for the pawn. So you've got to move down, and then black keeps on giving check. And you've got to move down, and black keeps on giving check. Now, it's really important you don't cross over too soon, because the rook will come down the board and come back and at least be able to sacrifice for the pawn, depending on what white does. White should be careful not to lose. But a better move for white, rather than crossing over to the c file, is to keep moving down. And then after rook to d3 check, now white plays the move king to c2, because the rook can't come behind the king. There is no square called rook to d0, no matter how hard we try. You might think it's time for black to just give up, because white is definitely getting a queen in this position, at least it would appear so, and queen versus rook is a win, as I already showed you in my video on pawnless endgames. However, black does have one last trick up his sleeve. Black can play this really neat move, rook to d4. And if you promote to a queen, rook to c4 is a draw. It forks the king and the queen. And when the queen takes the rook, it is stalemate. Wow, who saw that Hollywood endgame coming? Oh, actually, I did, because I invented this video. Instead, white can actually promote to a rook, the surprise of all surprises. And this is one of the 1% of rook versus rook endgames that's a win. The reason is we're threatening mate on black. Black has to play rook here. There's no more stalemate ideas. But then king to b3, and there's a double threat. Obviously, the threat on the rook, and we've switched the line of attack. Rook c1 is also mate, and there are no tricks left for black. No stalemates, no way to save himself. Now, they say when you're running a long distance, at the very end, you should have a little bit of a cool down. We're going to have a little bit of a cool down here. This is actually one of the easier examples. So take a deep breath, chess kids. This one's not so hard. In this position, even though we're looking at it from the white perspective, we're going to pretend that we're black, okay? So the white pawn is traveling up the chessboard. In these types of positions, the only way to win is to stop the white king from helping the pawn. And it only works because the white pawn is so far away from the finish line. So the winning move for black, and the only winning move, is actually rook to b4, stopping the white king from advancing. Now, if white just hangs out, twiddling his thumbs, watching some Netflix, black can move his king all the way up and around, get back in the defense, and of course black will eventually collect the pawn. The problem for white is that if he tries active measures with pawn h5, black's king can still come all the way up and around the rook. It may not be the fastest way, but as long as the king eventually moves up, he will collect the pawn. And if white goes any further, here comes the trick. We actually force the pawn one square further, you can see why this wouldn't work if the pawn was too far up the board. The pawn would have already made a promotion. And then we play the move rook to h6, and we collect the pawn. So that idea of cutting off the king, very important way for the rook to defeat the pawn. But wait, there's more. All good Hollywood movies have a part 2. We're not going to do a part 2, but we are going to have kind of like an alternate ending to our video, or an extra ending. It's like the credits are rolling and then they show extra scenes. Yeah, that's what we're going for. In this position, rook versus 2 pawns. This actually makes the complication factor a lot higher. So we're just going to do one of these examples, but we might throw a few more at you in the lesson that follows this video. Now, normally we say 2 pawns on the 6th, or in this case, the 3rd rank, are better than a rook. And you know what? If the black king were not in such an unfortunate position, that would be true. Actually, black might be winning if his king was really anywhere else on the board. However, black is actually losing because of the placement of the king. This one is quite hard. If you get it in less than 5 minutes, you're probably going to have my job one day. Go ahead and pause your video, figure out how white can amazingly not only save the draw, but win this game. If you're back, you're after my job. And the winning move for white is rook to d2 check. Now, obviously the king can't go to a3 because you'll just play rook d3 and you'll start playing Pac-Man with all the pawns. And if the king goes to a really unfortunate square like a1, well, then you'll just play king b3 and you'll mate on the next turn. So let's not give black such a bad starting move. The best try for black is king to b1. Now comes the really hard move. King to c3. Not aligning the kings. What an amazing chess move. Now black, if he starts pushing the pawns with g2, then white wins via this very cool method. Rook to d1 check, and then rook to g1, and black is in Zugzwang. If he pushes h2, rook takes g2 check, collects all the pawns, and the only other legal move for black is king here, but then of course rook to a1 is mate. So we need to go back to this position. Black's best try is to play king to c1. Now white wins with rook to a2, obviously threatening mate on a1. And if the king goes to b1, we'll take a look at that in just a minute. But what if the king goes to d1? Well, then we line up the kings again. And if the king keeps on running, we keep lining up the kings. And if he runs some more, well, guess what? We line up the kings again. And we either collect all your pawns or we checkmate you. Black can decide which way he wants to lose. Okay, let's go back. One last line. If the king goes to b1, then white can win with rook to e2. Now, obviously, black better not move the king to c1. That would just be lining up the kings for a checkmate. So now black has to try pushing a pawn. By the way, going to the corner doesn't help because king b3 forces mate. So black pushes a pawn. It doesn't matter which one. We'll just pick the g pawn. Rook to e1 check, king to a2, rook to g1. And we've already seen this position. Black is in Zugzwang. He either loses all of his pawns or he gets mated in one move. He gets to decide this Hollywood ending. But either way, it's not going to turn out well for the black pieces. Wow. Rook versus 1 pawn. Rook versus 2 pawns. I'll bet you 10 minutes ago you didn't know how complicated these could be. In fact, Funmaster Mike had to study these endgames himself just to be able to prepare a video. That shows you how difficult they can be. Now, stay tuned for the lesson that comes after this video because that's where we're going to do even more difficult rook versus pawn and rook versus 2 pawn endgames.